Hello, BookTube, and welcome to March Mystery Madness. That's a big BookTube event, a big hullabaloo spread over a great many BookTube channels, wonderful channels, in which all throughout the month of March we celebrate all things murder mystery. I'm sure you've seen a lot of these videos in your subscription feed, and the organizers of March Mystery Matters are doing a whole bunch of other great stuff too. It's not just videos. There's Goodreads groups and reading sprints and live streams, all sorts of bells and whistles. I keep meaning to put some links, and I keep forgetting to do that. I will try and remember to put some links in this video to some of the rest of it, just in case you're not seeing it in your subscription feed. But for my own channel, what I've been doing for March Mystery Madness, what I think I will do for the rest of the month, is concentrate on new releases. With a few exceptions. Yesterday, for instance, I talked about an older series. And a lot of these things, these new releases, are the latest installments in old series. That's murder mystery series are a staple of the genre. Almost nobody writes standalone murder mysteries, one after another after another. Because your characters and your setting and whatnot, your gimmick, takes off with your readers. Not maybe the first one you try, maybe not the second one you try, but eventually, if you're lucky, you hit a formula that your readers like and they want more of, sometimes dozens and dozens of novels. And one of the book that I want to concentrate on today is the latest novel in a series. It's by Charles Todd, the mother and son writing team of Charles Todd, and it's The Black Ascot. And these are, we talked at the beginning of March Mystery Madness about all the little subgenres that fit under the huge umbrella of mysteries. And one of those was historical, and these are historical. They deal with a World War I vet, a World War I veteran, who was badly shell-shocked at the Battle of the Somme. This is, well, I'll read you a little bit about it. He's a Scotland Yard inspector named Rutledge, and he has a wonderful, even before he went to the war, he had a wonderful knack for observation, for minutia, and for discordant things. And when he comes back from the war, he comes back a changed man, to put it mildly. Let me read you the rough description here of this current book. Is just a sort of Rutledge comes back with what we would consider now to be PTSD. He comes back with shell shock, bad shell shock, where, to paraphrase the great television show The West Wing, he usually cannot remember his trauma without reliving it. And in his case, it takes the form of a very personal manifestation. A man he shot during the war. He now hears that man's voice in his head. We get a little description of it each time with each new novel, just so that new readers are brought up to speed. The voice in his head had followed him from France, from the trenches and the war. Rutledge knew very well that Corporal Hamish MacLeod was dead. He'd fired the bullet that had ended the man's life. After the war, he'd found and stood over Hamish's grave in the Flanders mud, yet he couldn't silence the soft Scots voice that lived in his own mind. To try would be tantamount to firing his revolver a second time. He learned simply to endure. And as in many other earlier Rutledge novels, we get readers to the book get Hamish's dialogue in Rutledge's head before they get that explanation. So they are a little disoriented as well. And that's as it should be. And that is the personal manifestation of Rutledge's shell shock. But there are other manifestations that aren't quite so personal. And in this book, the plot looks to the past. It's virtually designed, in fact, because these two know what they're doing, it is designed to dig right into the very thin veneer of control that Rutledge has begun to reassert over his own life. So let's see here. After saving an ex-convict's life, Inspector Ian Rutledge receives an astonishing tip about a legendary crime from the grateful man. Implausible though it sounds, Rutledge must report this information to his superior at Scotland Yard. Scotland Yard does not have an unblemished record of sympathy and support when it comes to Rutledge and his condition. Still, if true, the tip could lead to capturing Alan Barrington, the suspect in an appalling murder during Black Ascot, the famous 1910 royal horse races that honored the late King Edward VII. Barrington's disappearance before his trial had set off a manhunt that spanned the globe, baffling Scotland Yard and consuming all of Britain for nearly a decade. But why should Barrington return to England now? The Yard, eager to restore its reputation, smarting from accusations of incompetence, orders Rutledge to quietly investigate. To avoid attracting attention of the press, he must employ the cover of routine review of a cold case. A cold case that ends up being connected to Barrington. Meticulously retracing the original inquiry, Rutledge begins to know Alan Barrington well, delving into his relationships and uncovering secrets that hadn't surfaced in 1910. As he draws closer, perhaps too close, to the man, the investigation is suddenly thrown into turmoil when Rutledge's sanity is questioned by a shocking turn of events, and his life is changed by his darkest fear, the exposure of his shell shock. And that happens in due course in this novel. There's nothing rushed or hurried. This writing team really knows what they're doing. And one of their strengths is dialogue, which it sounds a little cliche to say, but if you read murder mysteries, especially if you read more of them than I do, you know that often dialogue is a weak spot. It's not often that writers understand that dialogue in a novel, even a mystery novel, should do more than just have convey what people are saying to each other. It should do work on its own. It's not just a dictaphone. And the dialogue in these books, very often does that. Whereas in some of my favorite murder mysteries, it does not. For instance, the Amelia Peabody mysteries by Elizabeth Peters, which sadly I don't think are currently made anymore, so they won't be. We might look back on the Amelia Peabody mysteries, but we won't talk about them as new releases. The dialogue in those books, however spirited, it's sparkling like champagne, but it's inert in terms of the work it does for the book. Some people just don't do that. They just don't have their dialogue do that. They don't seem to understand that dialogue has its origins in theater, and that in theater, everything that happens has to work. Everything that happens on the stage has to work. There's no such thing as... but I want to read you an example of that. Rutledge is talking with the widow, or the sister, of a rival of Barrington's, whose death was ruled a suicide. and the more that Rutledge digs around in Barrington's past, under the guise of wondering if he is still around and might be brought to English justice, the more Rutledge, in a classic murder mystery style, starts to uncover all sorts of other things that he wasn't looking for, that no one expected to find. That's what you get. It's not what you get in cold cases in the real world, but it's what you get in cold cases in murder mysteries every single day. And this is the scene where he's talking to the aggrieved sister. Then you do believe he killed himself? Yes. No. He could have done, because there was no going back to his pretty world. I don't know. He wasn't thinking of us, I know that. Or it wouldn't have been Beachy Head, that's where the alleged suicide took place. He'd have shot himself while cleaning his gun. This is the sister talking. It could have been put down to an accident. Even if a few people suspected the truth, the world at large would have accepted that. Did he have enemies? This is Rutledge questioning her. Did he have enemies? Someone who might have wished him dead? Fellow investors, perhaps? Her gaze came back to him, such a hungry look in her expression that he was startled. I hadn't thought of murder. Oh, dear God. She simply sat there, vulnerable and uncertain. Mark? I'm not suggesting that as an alternative to choice of suicide. There's nothing in the files to indicate that he had enemies. Not even my father considered murder. It never occurred to me that Blanche might have killed him, because he'd lost all his money. It was Rutledge's turn to be shocked, and he did his best to conceal it. Blanche was in London. There are witnesses. She wasn't there at Beachy Head. Couldn't have been her. There are men who would have gladly done her bidding. The sister shook her head. Is it murder to drive someone to suicide? To make them so wretched, so ashamed that living with that is more than they can possibly endure? Think about it. She didn't mourn very long, did she? She married wealth and position, and people invited her to dinner parties again, Mark forgotten in her new life. Before Rutledge could comment on that, she leaned forward earnestly. It hadn't crossed my mind before, but now... What if the point of the motor car crash was to rid herself of Harold Fletcher Monroe? She hadn't counted on dying instead. Someone had tampered with the motor car, Rutledge points out, obviously indicating that it couldn't have been the woman in question. Yes, but that's not the question, is it? Perhaps what was intended was for him to be driving alone. Only it didn't happen that way. Blanche was in the motor car, too. And you see what happens in that little scene. That happens all throughout the book. What happens in that little scene is that we are watching while characters learn and think new things. They're not learning and thinking those things and then announcing them in dialogue. It's happening. The dialogue is the representation of that. And I think that's wonderful. And it's not easy to do. This is a terrific entry in the series. I have loved everything in this series. I watched with an eagle eye at the beginning for a reason you could probably guess, because of Hamish's voice in Rutledge's head. It's perfectly fine if Hamish's voice is a personal manifestation of shock, of trauma. That's perfectly fine. The thing I was watching for was for Hamish's voice to tell Rutledge something that Rutledge's own intuition could not possibly know. Bodies under the floorboard. Phone number begins with 866. Something like that. Something that would indicate, in a very cheap way, in a horribly cheapening way, that Hamish is a real ghost. And that never happens in these books. Never. It's always... Rutledge has a phenomenal intuition and instincts for crime solving on his own, and he has just sort of offloaded some of that to Hamish in the course of these novels. So Hamish sometimes points out the obvious. He often is, I want to say armchair, but he's not real. He's not corporeal. This is sometimes an armchair psychiatrist. Because one of the things that this series does that you don't really think about until you sort of put the book down, when you're reading the book, you're caught up in the plot. But when you put the book down, you realize that what a horrible position people like Rutledge were in 1910 or 1920. Because they had all of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that we understand today, but no one understood it then. People thought of shell shock as malingering, as being a wimp, and there was no such thing as treatment. It's an amazing thing. In a less assured writing team, readers would probably be hit over the head with that. Instead, they're not. The sympathy, like I said, the sympathy comes when you put the book down. When the book is in full gallop, you are concerned with the plot and with the characters, and it's all wonderfully done. And it, I know I mentioned at the beginning of this little March Mystery Madness installment that this falls under the heading of historical. It's well done. The historical details, the immersion is well done. It's not ostentatious. You're not beaten over the head with, proper nouns and, oh, did you know this? And, oh, here's a local usage there. Some historical novelists cannot leave that out. They've done all the research and they want to drag you through it. But it's a much lighter touch in these books without ever being, as far as I can tell, very much wrong. But it's not just historical, though. It's also a kind of murder mystery, recurring murder mystery that we haven't really talked about yet. This is turning out to be a rampant bodily functions video where I'm sneezing and burping and belching. I'm peeing right now. Sorry about that. But anyway, the type that I want to mention here, and mainly I want to do it to pick your brains, is the damaged detective. Not an anti-hero, not scornful, and not ruined by the world, but damaged, actually damaged. Someone who himself is a work in progress. Rutledge has a bad setback in the course of this book, and it's not the first one. We see him right at the edge of his own sanity in a few books. And when I was thinking about this in terms of talking about it with you today, and belching and burping about it with you today, and sneezing about it with you today, and slurping about it with you today, I also wondered what other examples there are of that, of damaged detectives. Off the top of my head, I can't think of many. People who I'm not really talking about people who are flat broke, or who lost everything in a financial bubble or something like that, or even really people who are crippled. Like Ironsides would be a name that none of you remember, but something where someone who doesn't have the use of his legs, or doesn't have she can't see, something like that. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about psychological. Can you think of other detective stories that are well done, where the detective is grappling with their own demons in addition to the demons, the killers and the murderers out there? I'd be curious to hear any of your recommendations. Not a lot of titles like that are coming to my mind. This is a wonderful series for that. And that is our March Mystery Madness for today. It's The Black Ascot by Charles Todd. I recommend this whole series. And this latest one, not only is it the latest, the last few cover designs on these have been so stylish, but it's also tremendously entertaining. It's not maudlin. It doesn't ever dawdle. It rips right along to where we learn all there is to know about the notorious Barrington, but we learn all sorts of stuff that happened that is as bad or worse than anything that he was ever thought to be connected with, and that wouldn't have come to light without this renewed tip, this new sort of quiet police investigation to finally remove a smudge from their reputation, from the Yard's reputation. All sorts of other things come to light in the course of that. I love that. I love it when it's done well. So I want to recommend this again, and we will be back tomorrow, barring burping and belching, for more March Mystery Madness. And we have plenty of other bookish things to talk about as well. So I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.